The night it happened, there was no warning. No argument that built slowly over days. No final straw that everyone could see coming. Just a door opening, a voice without warmth, and three words that landed like a verdict. Get your stuff. Greg Holland said it the way men say things they've already decided. Not loud, not cruel in any theatrical way. Just final. The kind of final that doesn't leave room for a question, doesn't expect a response, doesn't care either way what you do next. He said it, then turned back to the kitchen counter and poured himself another cup of coffee, like he hadn't just ended something important, like what he'd done was no more significant than switching off a light in a room he was leaving. Callie Marsh stood in the hallway of the only house she'd known for the last 4 years and looked at her mother. Noreen was sitting at the kitchen table. She had a magazine open in front of her. She didn't turn the page. She didn't look up. Her hands rested on either side of the glossy cover, like she'd been placed there by someone else, like she was a photograph of a woman who had already made her choice a long time ago and was simply waiting for the moment to finish passing. Callie waited. She didn't know exactly what she was waiting for. A word, a look, something small enough to be deniable but real enough to hold on to later. She waited the way you wait when you still believe even slightly that the person sitting across from you remembers who you are to them, what you mean, what they owe you, simply by virtue of having brought you into the world. Noreen didn't move. A woman sitting at a table pretending to read a magazine while her daughter was erased from the room. That was all it was. That was the whole of it. Callie went to her bedroom. She took 7 minutes. She knew because she watched the red numbers on the old clock radio count up while she moved, and watching them was easier than thinking about what was happening. She took her backpack. She put in 2 changes of clothes, her phone charger, a granola bar she found in the bottom of a desk drawer, and a photograph. The photograph was creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded more times than she could count. It was of a man standing in a backyard, squinting slightly against summer light, wearing a gray t-shirt with a small paint stain on the left shoulder. He was smiling like he didn't know the picture was being taken, like he was just alive and happy, and that was enough. She put the photograph in the front pocket of the backpack, zipped it closed, and left. She didn't say anything on her way out. She thought for a moment about saying something, about finding one sentence that could carry everything she felt, the years, the losses, the weight of standing in a hallway and being made invisible. But there was no sentence for that. And even if there had been, neither of them deserved to hear it from her tonight. So she pulled the front door shut behind her carefully, without slamming it, and stepped out into the Texas night. The rain started before she reached the end of the driveway. Austin in November has a particular kind of cold that people from other states always underestimate. It isn't the bone-deep freeze of the north. It's wetter than that, heavier, like the air itself has given up trying to be anything other than miserable. The rain that night came in sideways, pushed by a low wind that found every gap in her jacket and settled there. Within a block, her jeans were soaked through. Within 2 blocks, she stopped noticing. She walked without a destination. That sounds dramatic, but it wasn't. It was simply the truth of her situation. There was no friend's house waiting at the end of the road. There was no aunt, no cousin, no one from school who would open a door at 11 at night and say, "Come in, don't worry, stay as long as you need." There had been a time before when there might have been, when she was a different kind of girl in a different kind of life, with a father who was still alive, in a house that still felt like one. But that was 7 years ago, and the people who populate a life when things are good have a way of quietly disappearing when things are not. She had $9. She knew exactly because she'd counted it that afternoon, sitting on her bed running the mental math of what she could realistically do if things went wrong. She hadn't known things would go wrong that same night, but she'd felt something in the air of that house for weeks, a tightening of pressure, the way weather feels before a storm that hasn't announced itself yet. So she'd counted $9 and some change. The change she left on her dresser because it was too heavy to carry and too small to matter. She passed a gas station, walked past it, then stopped. She stopped not because she had a plan, but because her feet stopped. Because some part of her that was still operating below the level of rational thought recognized that she'd been walking for almost 40 minutes in the rain and hadn't eaten since noon and had nowhere to be, and the fluorescent light coming through the gas station window was the only warm-colored thing she'd seen in the last half hour. She turned around and walked back to it. The parking lot was mostly empty. A truck at one of the pumps with its engine-running driver inside window fogged over. A shopping cart on its side near the curb, left there by someone who hadn't cared enough to walk it back. And then parked at the far edge of the lot near the dumpsters, nearly swallowed by shadow. Something she almost didn't register at first. A vehicle. Old, enormous in the way things built in another era are enormous, not stylized or designed for impression, but simply large because function required it. A recreational vehicle, the kind families once drove across the country in, when that was the thing families did, the kind that showed up in old photographs beside national parks and highway rest stops. This one had not been to a national park in a long time. The paint, which had once been white or close to it, had gone the color of old teeth. Rust had worked its way up the wheel wells and along the bottom panels in long orange streaks, like wounds that had never been cleaned properly. One of the side windows was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. The front grille was bent inward on the left side. The tires looked like they were holding air through sheer stubbornness. There was a piece of cardboard taped to the door. She didn't go closer at first. She just looked at it from where she stood, rain dripping from the bill of her hood. The cardboard was handwritten in black marker, the letters slightly uneven the way writing looks when a person hasn't done it carefully, but has done it honestly. For sale. $10. As is. She almost laughed. Almost. The sound formed somewhere in her chest but didn't make it to her mouth. Instead, she just stood there looking at this broken, forgotten, rained-on thing parked at the edge of a gas station lot, like it had been left there by someone who'd given up on it somewhere between here and wherever they'd been going. She recognized the feeling. A man appeared from around the side of the vehicle. He was older, somewhere past 60, wearing a jacket that had probably been brown once and was now the color of something that spent a lot of time near engines. He had the kind of face that had been outside for most of its life, lined in a way that wasn't ugly, just earned. His eyes were dark and deeply set, and they were looking at her without any particular surprise, like he'd been expecting someone to show up eventually. He just hadn't known exactly when. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low and even. "You didn't," Callie said. He nodded once, looked at the RV, looked back at her. He had a paper cup of something in his right hand, and he lifted it slightly in a vague gesture. "You looking or just looking? Does it run?" He considered this for a moment with the seriousness of a man who takes words at their actual weight. "Sometimes," he said. "What does that mean?" "Means it'll get you somewhere. Might not get you back." He paused. "Depends on where you're trying to go." Callie looked at the vehicle again. The cracked window, the rust, the cardboard sign that someone had written out and taped up with the kind of minimal effort that says, "I know this is not worth much, but I'm trying anyway." "I've got $9, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in weeks, maybe longer. The man looked at her for a long moment. His expression held something more patient than judgment, more careful than assessment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a set of keys on a plain metal ring. 2 keys, that was it. "Nine's fine," he said. She looked at him. "You're serious?" "Already said it." She pulled the money out of her jacket pocket. Bills and a folded single she'd forgotten about, which brought it to exactly $9. She held it out. He took it without counting it and put it in the same pocket the keys had come from. He held the keys out to her. She reached for them. He didn't let go immediately. "There's a door in the back," he said. His voice had changed in a way she couldn't quite quantify. Not louder, not softer, more deliberate, the way voices get when the words being said are the only ones that matter in that particular moment. "A door," she said, "at the end of the back hallway. It's locked." He paused. "Leave it alone." She waited for more. He didn't offer any. His expression hadn't changed, but there was something behind it now, something that looked like old grief, or the look a person gets when they're choosing not to say a thing they know they should. "Why?" she asked. Not my place to say. Whose place is it? He released the keys. She felt the weight of them settle into her palm. Get inside, he said. You're getting wet. And then he walked away. Not hurrying, not looking back, just walked around the side of the building and was gone. She stood there for a moment longer, keys in her hand, rain still coming down the RV in front of her like a question she hadn't asked yet. She climbed in. The smell hit first the way it always does in old enclosed spaces. Dust and something faintly chemical underneath old fabric. A trace of what might have been coffee or rust or simply time compressed into a closed space. But it was dry. That registered before anything else. It was dry and it was out of the rain, and the moment she pulled the door shut behind her, the sound of the storm dropped by half, becoming something muffled and distant. She stood just inside the door for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The interior was worse than the exterior, which made a kind of sense. The overhead light she found and switched on flickered twice before committing to its job. Wires hung from a gap in the ceiling paneling near the back. One of the cabinet doors on the left wall was missing entirely. The small table bolted to the floor had a crack running through the center of it. The vinyl on the bench seating was split and peeling in long strips. But the roof was intact. She checked, pressed her palm to the ceiling in 3 different places. No give, no dampness. The floor didn't shift when she walked across it, which meant the frame was still sound. The windows, even the cracked one, kept the rain out. She sat down on the bench seat. For a long time, she just sat. The rain worked at the sides of the vehicle in waves, and the old metal absorbed the sound and gave it back as something lower, almost percussive, almost rhythmic. She thought about Noreen's hands on the table, perfectly still. She thought about what it means to love someone who chooses not to see you. She thought about the sound of Greg's voice, the complete absence of anything in it. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long time. Not from toughness, not from suppression, just from a kind of exhaustion that sits below feeling. Below the place where tears originate in some deeper channel, where things are stored without being processed. She'd been living in that channel for a while now. She opened her backpack and took out the photograph. The man in the gray t-shirt with the paint stain, the backyard, the summer light, James Marsh. Her father had died when Callie was 10 years old. That was the version she'd been given, the version that arrived in a phone call her aunt received and relayed in a low voice, while Callie sat on the other side of a wall listening through the plaster. Car accident. Upstate. He'd been driving alone. These were the components she'd been handed. She assembled them into a story and lived inside that story for 7 years because it was the only one available. He was not a complicated man in the version of him she remembered. He was careful. He fixed things. He had a way of sitting next to her when she was upset without saying anything at all, just being present as if the presence itself was the point, and the words were secondary. She'd inherited his silences, she thought. Maybe that was what remained when someone left too soon. You inherited the shape of who they were. She looked at his face in the photograph for a long time. Then she put it back in the front pocket of the backpack, carefully, the way you put something away that you're not ready to stop thinking about. She went exploring. The RV was maybe 30 feet from door to back wall. The front section had the driver and passenger seats, both cracked, both somehow still functional in the way of old American things, built to outlast everything, including their own dignity. Behind that was a living area she'd already assessed. Then a narrow galley that had once been a kitchen. The small stove non-functional, a sink with no running water cabinets above and below. She opened them one by one. Empty. Empty. A rusted can of something with the label gone. Empty. A balled-up plastic bag. Empty. Then one that wasn't empty. The cabinet in the corner of the galley, small, maybe 18 inches wide, the door hanging slightly open from a broken hinge. She pulled it the rest of the way open. Inside a metal box. Not a lockbox, nothing high security, just a rectangular container, the kind you'd find in a hardware store, meant for keeping documents safe from moisture. Old. The surface was pitted with age. There was no lock, just a simple clasp that had corroded slightly and required pressure to open. She stood there looking at it. The man's voice came back to her. Not about the box, about the door. The locked door at the end of the hallway. She looked toward the back of the RV, and yes, there it was, a narrow hallway between the galley and what must have been a sleeping area, and at the end of it, even in the low light, she could see a door. Different from the rest. Metal where the rest was wood veneer, solid. The kind of door that doesn't belong in a vehicle. That looks like it was installed by someone with a deliberate intention. She looked at the door, she looked at the box in the cabinet. She took the box, she carried it back to the bench seat, set it on the cracked table, and worked the clasp open. Inside, the first thing she saw was a rubber band wrapped around a thick stack of papers. The rubber band was old and dried, and it snapped the moment she tried to remove it, the pieces falling apart in her hands. She set them aside. The papers were not random. They weren't junk mail or old bills or the miscellaneous debris that accumulates over time. They were organized, neatly stacked, each one placed with intention in an order that meant something to whoever had arranged them. She started going through them slowly. The first few pages looked like technical documentation. Diagrams she couldn't read, numbers and columns, dense text in a typeface that suggested something institutional, professional, formal. She turned the pages carefully, not understanding the content, looking for context, looking for something to anchor herself to. And then she found it, about a dozen pages in. At the top of a document that appeared to be some kind of project summary, a name printed clearly in standard type. She stopped. She read it again. James A. Marsh. Her hands did not shake. They were very still, in fact, which she would think about later, the way stillness can be a form of shock just as much as trembling can. She sat very still and looked at her father's name printed at the top of a document inside a metal box, inside a cabinet, inside a broken RV she had just purchased for $9 in the rain in a gas station parking lot in Austin, Texas. She turned the page. His name was there again, and again on the next page, attached to specific notations and entries, dates, addresses, technical references she didn't understand, numbers that appeared to be identification codes or project markers. His name over and over, embedded in documents that looked like they had been produced by an organization of some size, some resources, some seriousness of purpose. She went back to the beginning of the stack and started over slower this time. One address appeared more than anything else in those pages, more than any other piece of data. She counted the times it appeared before she reached the halfway point of the stack. 14 times, once embedded in a paragraph, twice in what appeared to be internal correspondence, 11 times in what she slowly recognized as some kind of log entries dated across a span of several years, each one referencing the same address, the way a home address gets referenced automatically, as a fixed point. 1847 Meridian Avenue Northwest, Austin, Texas. She read it until she had it memorized. She wrote it on the inside of her wrist with a pen from the bottom of her backpack, pressing hard enough that the ink would last through the night. Then she sat back and looked at the hallway. The locked door at the end of it was silent. The old metal surface caught a thin line of light from somewhere, the gas station lights outside probably, and held it. Just a door. Just a closed, locked, inexplicable door at the end of a hallway, in a vehicle that somehow impossibly contained her dead father's name, written in a dozen different documents, as though he had worked, lived, and mattered in ways she'd never been shown. She remembered what the man had said. Leave it alone. She didn't go to the door that night, not because she wasn't tempted. She felt the pull of it, the way you feel the pull of something sore you can't stop pressing. But she was 17 years old, alone, in a gas station parking lot with nothing, and a body that hadn't eaten enough, and a mind that had absorbed more than it could process in the space of a few hours. There was an order to things. Survival came before answers. She needed to still be functioning tomorrow if she wanted tomorrow to mean anything at all. She arranged what she had as best she could. Her jacket over her like a blanket, her backpack under her head, as something approximating a pillow. The rain kept coming outside steady and indifferent, and the metal of the RV absorbed it. And after a while, the sound became something like white noise, which was close enough to comfort that she let it stand in for the real thing. She took the photograph out one more time, set it on the table so she could see it in the faint light. "I don't know what's happening," she said to it. Her voice was very quiet. She didn't know if she was talking to the photograph or to herself or to some idea of her father that still lived in the space between memory and need. She closed her eyes. She slept for exactly 4 hours and 20 minutes, waking when a truck started up somewhere nearby and the sound pulled her back to the surface. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she did. Then she remembered everything in the rapid, sequential way that sleep forgetfulness gives way to, and she lay there for 60 seconds, letting the specifics resettle. Her father's name, the documents, the address, the door. She sat up. The rain had stopped. The parking lot outside was wet and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after sustained noise, where the silence itself feels provisional. The fluorescent lights of the gas station still burn. A bird somewhere made a single sound and then stopped. She was hungry. The low, consistent warning kind of hunger that tells you it's going to become urgent if not addressed. She had no money. She'd spent everything on the RV. She got up, used the one functioning gas station bathroom to make herself presentable, which was a limited project, splashed water on her face, looked at herself in the spotted mirror above the sink for long enough to confirm she was still there, still solid, still functional in the basic ways that mattered. Then she walked. The mechanic's shop was 3 blocks from the gas station, which she knew because she'd walked past it twice the previous night without registering it consciously. It was not open yet when she arrived, but a man was in the back lot moving things around with the purposeful movement of someone who started his day earlier than his business hours required. She stood at the chain-link fence at the edge of the lot and waited for him to notice her. When he did, she said, "I'll clean the lot for $20. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, not warmly either. The look of a man evaluating a proposition on its practical merits. "20 steep for a morning sweep," he said. "I'll do the bays too," she said, "and the windows on the street side." He looked at the lot which needed it. He looked at the windows which also needed it. Then he nodded and went back inside and came back with a broom and a bucket and a bottle of something and handed them to her without saying anything else. She worked for 2 hours without stopping. She focused on the task in front of her with the complete attention that physical labor allows, the quiet mercy of work that gives your hands something to do while your mind stays still. She swept and hauled and scrubbed, and by the time she was done, her arms were aching and her back was reminding her that she'd slept on a vinyl bench, but the lot was clean and the windows were clear. The man paid her in cash without being asked, counted out $20, handed it over, and said, "Good work," in the voice of someone who didn't compliment easily. That made it worth something. She bought bread and peanut butter from the gas station, a bottle of water. She ate sitting on the front steps of the RV door propped open behind her, watching the morning settle into place. Cars passing, a dog trotting along the opposite sidewalk with the confident purposefulness of a dog who knows exactly where it's going. The sun beginning to do something to the eastern sky that wasn't quite warmth yet, but was working toward it. She ate slowly, making it last. Then she went back inside and sat down with the documents. She went through them again more carefully now that she was fed and rested enough to see clearly. She read everything that could be read without specialized knowledge, and she made notes on the back of one of the pages. Not about the technical content, which remained largely opaque to her, but about the patterns, the dates, the names of which there were several she didn't recognize, and one that appeared almost as frequently as her father's, a name she couldn't yet attach to a face. Victor Crane, and the address, 1847 Meridian Avenue Northwest. Still legible on her wrist, slightly blurred from the water and the work of the morning, but still there. She looked at it. She made a decision. The walk took 50 minutes through the shifting geography of a city in the middle of a weekday, past neighborhoods and side streets, and the gradually changing architecture that indicates you're moving from one kind of Austin into another, from worn residential blocks towards something more institutional, more deliberate, more expensive in its self-presentation. She came around a corner and stopped. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. Something industrial, maybe. Something anonymous. The kind of building that does its business quietly because its business doesn't want attention. That was the story her mind had written on the walk over the story that seemed to fit with a broken RV and hidden documents and a man who wouldn't explain himself. What stood at 1847 Meridian Avenue in W was something else entirely. Glass. Tall glass windows, 4 stories, at least the kind of building that costs money to clean because it costs money to design. Someone had once sat in a room and decided this building would say something about the organization inside it. The thing it said was, "We are serious, we are permanent, and we are not going anywhere." There were cameras at every visible corner, not conspicuous, not the kind placed to be seen as a deterrent, but present, the kind placed by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. The security gate on the right side of the building was manned by a guard standing the way. People stand when their job is to be the last obstacle between here and inside. A sign on the glass face of the building, clean and black and precise, Nexara Corporation. Callie stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it. Her father's name was in documents that led to this building. This clean, serious, expensive building with its cameras and its guard and its glass face that told you nothing about what happened on the other side of it. The man she'd known, the man in the photograph with the paint stain on his shirt, the man who fixed things and sat quietly next to you when you were upset, had somehow in some life she had never been shown, been connected to a place like this. She didn't go closer. She understood without needing to analyze it that walking up to a security gate and asking questions was not the move. She was 17 years old, with no credentials, no story that would get her past the man at the gate. She would be dismissed in 30 seconds, and they would remember her face, which was the last thing she needed. So she sat down on a bench near the bus stop across the street, and she waited and she watched. She learned things. She'd always been good at learning by watching, by staying still and quiet, and paying attention to what people did when they thought no one was evaluating them. The security rotation she tracked across a 90-minute window. The side entrance where deliveries came and went with a rhythm she began to understand. The way employees moved through the main entrance, key cards, body language, the comfortable automatic motion of people in a place they've been 1,000 times. And then, late in the afternoon, when the light was going amber and the temperature was dropping, someone came out of the main entrance who was different from the others. Not in an obvious way. He was wearing a suit like others had. He had the same forward momentum, the same sense of ownership over his immediate space that people carry when they're used to rooms clearing for them. But something in the way he moved was specific individual, the movement of someone who isn't just an employee, but is the reason employees exist. Mid-50s, silver at the temples, the kind of physical presence that isn't about size but about certainty. A man who had spent decades being the decision and not the consequence. Callie's hand went to her backpack before she'd consciously made the decision. She unzipped the front pocket, took out the photograph. In the photograph, her father was standing next to a man. She'd looked at this photograph 1,000 times. She'd always focused on her father, on the gray t-shirt, on the smile, on the summer light. She'd registered the other man the way you register background details as context rather than content. She looked at the other man now. She looked at the man walking out of Nexara Corporation. Her breath stopped. Not dramatically, just a quiet internal cessation while her mind did the work of confirming what her eyes were already telling her. Same jaw. Same way of holding the head slightly forward, slightly angled. Same build, though he was older now. Visibly older, the kind of older that happens to men who have spent years making decisions that cost other people things. It was him. The man standing next to her father in a photograph that had to be at least 7 years old, probably more. Standing in front of what looked like a large structure, both of them smiling the kind of smile that two people share when they've built something together and are standing in front of the evidence of it. That man was now walking out of Nexara Corporation on a Tuesday afternoon, getting into a black car that had been waiting for him at the curb. Before he got in, he paused. He looked around the street in the methodical way of people who have security training or security habits, a slow scan thorough. His gaze moved across the sidewalk, across the bench at the bus stop, across the unremarkable teenage girl sitting there with her backpack and her hood, and nothing in particular to indicate she was anything other than someone waiting for a bus. His gaze moved on. The car door closed. The car pulled into traffic and was gone. Callie sat very still. She looked down at the photograph in her hands. She looked at the building behind where he had been standing. Victor Crane, the name from the documents. She said it quietly to herself to the empty sidewalk. Then she put the photograph back in the front pocket of her backpack and zipped it closed. The sky above Austin was going dark. The street lights were beginning to make their case against the coming night. Somewhere in the distance, traffic moved in its steady, indifferent river, and the city went on doing what cities do, sustaining its 10,000 simultaneous stories, indifferent to any particular one of them. Callie sat on the bench and did not move for a long time. She was thinking about a locked door at the end of a hallway in a broken RV, parked at a gas station 3 miles from where she was sitting. She was thinking about her father's name on a document, and then on another document, and then on 14 more. She was thinking about a woman sitting at a kitchen table with her hands perfectly still, choosing not to look up. She was thinking about what her father had always said, the things she'd heard so many times growing up that she'd stopped actually hearing it the way you stop hearing things that become part of the ambient texture of your life. He would say it when something broke, when something went wrong, when something in the small, ordinary machinery of daily life revealed its fragility. Every locked door, he would say, was locked by someone for a reason, and the reason always tells you something true. She hadn't thought about that in years. She thought about it now. She stood up from the bench, put her backpack on, looked at the building one more time, its glass face going dark and the early evening lights coming on inside the building, becoming opaque in a way it hadn't been during the day. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. The RV was where she'd left it, which shouldn't have surprised her, but somehow did the way things surprise you when you've been operating without certainty for long enough that the persistence of anything begins to feel like grace. She climbed in, sat back down at the table, put her backpack on the seat beside her. The locked door was at the end of the hallway. She didn't go to it. Not yet. She sat in the low light of the flickering overhead and listened to the city outside doing its ordinary evening things, and she looked at the address on her wrist, and she thought about the man in the photograph who had become the man in the suit walking out of a corporation that her father's name appeared in 14 times. Not yet, she told herself, but soon. She took the photograph out one last time and set it on the table. "Who were you?" she asked. Her father smiled against the summer light, squinting slightly paint stain on his shirt, looking like a man who didn't know the picture was being taken, who was just alive in that moment, in the ordinary way of people who don't yet know what's coming. Outside, Austin settled into night, and the RV held its silence, and the locked door at the end of the hallway waited with the patience of something that has been waiting a very long time already, and has learned that patience is simply the form waiting takes when it has no other choice. She was up before the sun. Not because she'd slept well, she hadn't. But there is a particular kind of wakefulness that exists at the intersection of exhaustion and urgency, where your body knows it needs sleep and your mind has decided that sleep is a secondary concern. She lay on the bench seat in the thin dark of early morning and watched the ceiling of the RV and thought about the photograph and the documents and the name on the building and the man who had walked out of it and gotten into a black car and looked around the street with the slow, deliberate scan of someone who checks his surroundings because he has learned to. Victor Crane. She turned the name over in her mind, the way you turn something unfamiliar in your hand, testing its weight, its edges, what it tells you about what it's made of. By 5:30, she gave up on the ceiling and sat up. By 6, she had eaten the last of the bread with peanut butter and drunk half the water. By 6:15, she was walking. The morning was cold in the way Austin cold works, not brutal, not honest, Just a persistent, low-grade chill that suggests the day is aware of your discomfort and has decided not to do anything about it. The streets were quiet in the way of places between one kind of day and the next. A few cars, a few people moving with the focused silence of people who are either going to or coming from something that happened in the dark. She walked the 50 minutes back to Meridian Avenue without stopping, without doing anything other than putting one foot in front of the other and watching the city gradually lighten around her. She took up her position across the street from Nexara Corporation before 7. The building was already operational. Lights on the upper floors, a car in the parking structure. The guard at the gate different from yesterday's, but with the same posture, the same quality of attention. She sat on the same bench at the bus stop and watched. She had learned enough from yesterday to know what normal looked like here. So today she was watching for what wasn't normal, for the variations and the exceptions, for the thing that doesn't fit the pattern it's been embedded in. She watched the gate. She watched the side entrance where deliveries came in. She watched the main entrance and the choreography of key cards and door holds, and the small social negotiations that happen at building entrances when people arrive at the same time and have to decide who goes first. At 8:47, a delivery truck pulled into the side entrance. She'd watched 3 others go through in the past 2 hours. The gate opened on a card presented by the driver. The truck rolled in slowly. The gate closed. 40 seconds from stop to close. She'd timed it precisely. This time, as the gate opened and the truck rolled forward, the angle was slightly different. The truck cab sitting higher than the previous ones, which meant the opening was visible for a longer moment, which meant she could see further into the interior of the building's side passage than she had before. She saw a hallway. Inside the hallway, past the delivery area, past the functional concrete block of the building's service entrance, there was a door. Her eyes found it and held it for the 3 or 4 seconds before the gate closed. Metal. Old, or at least older than the rest of the building. It had the same quality as the door at the end of the RV's hallway, not in its exact appearance, but in the sense it gave of being a door that meant something beyond simple passage. A door installed by someone who needed that particular space to be contained. Then the gate closed and the angle was gone, and she was looking at a building facade again. She stayed on the bench. At 9:23, the main entrance opened and Victor Crane walked out. She was ready this time. She already had the photograph in her hand, taken from the front pocket, before she'd sat down, held loosely against her thigh, where no one would see it at this distance. When he came through the door, she lifted it slightly and looked at it, and then looked at him and confirmed what her mind had already settled. But this time it wasn't just recognition. This time, looking at him, she understood something she hadn't had the language for yesterday. She was looking at the man who had known her father's name and decided to erase it. She was looking at the man who had handed her family a story about a car accident and watched them live inside it for 7 years. The physical confirmation she'd done yesterday now carried a different weight, heavier, colder, more specific to her in a way that made her jaw tighten and her hands go still against the bench. He stood outside the entrance and spoke to someone who had followed him out. A man in a suit who stood at the angle of someone receiving information rather than offering it. They spoke for perhaps 2 minutes. Then Crane said something brief and final. The other man nodded twice and went back inside, and Crane stood alone for a moment on the sidewalk. He looked at his phone, put it in his jacket pocket, looked up at the street. She looked down at the bench, not a sharp movement, just a gradual lowering of focus, as if she'd been looking at something in her hands the whole time. She counted to 10. Then she looked up again through the gap between the brim of her hood in the middle distance. He was getting into a different car from yesterday. Black again. The driver already had the door open. Before he got in, he paused the same pause as yesterday, the same methodical scan of the street. But this time he was closer to the entrance, and the angle was different, and for one moment she had the sensation of being directly in the line of someone's attention, even while their gaze was technically moving past her. She did not look away. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a decision in any conscious sense. It was more like the stillness she'd felt when she found her father's name on the documents, that quality of motionlessness the body produces when the mind is absorbing something too large for any other response. His eyes moved across her and kept moving. The car door closed. The car pulled out and disappeared into traffic. She sat very still for another 60 seconds. Then she stood up, put the photograph back in her pocket, and walked back the way she'd come. By the time the RV came into view in the gas station lot, something had settled in her. She couldn't have named it precisely. It wasn't calm, wasn't resolution in any completed sense. It was more like the sensation of having been walking toward a door for a long time and finally getting close enough to see that it's real, that it actually exists, that it was always going to be there at the end of the walk. She climbed inside. She went straight to the hallway. The door at the end of it was exactly as she'd left it. She'd half expected it to have changed somehow, the way things in dreams shift when you look away and look back. It hadn't. Same metal surface, same thin line of caught light, same quality of waiting. She stood in front of it. She put her hand flat against the surface, cold the way metal is cold, conducting the temperature around it without adding anything of its own. There was no handle on the door, just a keyhole below the midpoint, and around it marks in the metal. She looked carefully now. Scratches concentrated around the keyhole, the kind that accumulate when someone has tried to pick a lock or force a tool into one too many times. Someone had tried to open this door before, more than once. They hadn't succeeded. She went back to the galley, opened the cabinet below the sink where she'd seen a toolbox-shaped outline under a piece of cardboard the first night, but hadn't investigated. She moved the cardboard. Not a toolbox. A collection of tools without the box, a socket wrench, a pair of pliers, a flathead screwdriver, a length of metal rod, maybe 18 inches long, solid, slightly rusted at one end. She picked up the rod. She went back to the door. She looked at it one more time, not hesitating, just looking, giving the moment the weight it deserved before she changed it permanently. Then she raised the rod and brought it down against the area of the door frame where the latch would be seated. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, a sharp, ringing impact that the metal walls caught and threw back at her. She didn't flinch. She adjusted her grip and swung again, lower this time directly at the lock mechanism. The door shuddered. She could feel it through the rod. A third swing, putting her whole shoulder into it. A fourth. On the fifth, something inside the lock gave. Not all at once. More like a failure than an opening. A mechanical surrender she felt more than heard, a loss of resistance inside the door that changed the quality of the next impact. She pressed her palm against the surface and pushed, and the door moved. Cold air came out. Not the ambient cool of the RV interior, but something colder than that. Something that had been sealed for long enough to develop its own climate. A dry, stale cold that carried the quality of a space that hasn't exchanged air with the outside world in years. It moved past her face like a held breath finally released. She pushed the door all the way open and stepped inside. The compartment was small. Not a room in any ordinary sense of space, deliberately shaped its dimensions, roughly 3 feet by 6, running the width of the back of the RV, behind what she'd assumed was just the rear wall. Someone had planned this, had built it or modified the existing structure to create it with enough structural understanding to make it solid and enough intent to make it sealed. Metal shelving on the left and right walls, 4 shelves each. The floor was bare metal. The ceiling was low. The shelves were not empty. On the left, 3 metal boxes like the one she'd found in the kitchen cabinet, only larger. On the right, folded technical drawings, rolled document tubes, a flat rectangular case that looked like it held something requiring protection. On the middle shelf of the left wall between the boxes, a manila folder with nothing written on the outside. And on top of the folder, resting there, waiting, an envelope. White, letter-sized. On the front, written in handwriting, she recognized the way you recognize things you've been carrying for years without knowing it, in the combination of pressure and angle and character formation that is as individual as a fingerprint, Callie. If you found this, I'm sorry. She picked it up. She held it. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she wasn't usually aware of it, its pace and its weight, the physical fact of it. She was aware of the cold of the compartment and the silence of the RV and the city noise outside, distant and indifferent. She was aware of everything in the way you become aware of everything when you are about to open something that is going to change the shape of what you know. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages handwritten on lined paper, the handwriting the same as on the envelope but less composed. Not hurried, not panicked. The writing of someone who is choosing each word with more care than usual, who understands that these words may be the last ones, and is trying to make sure they carry everything they need to carry. She read it through once without stopping. Then she went back to the beginning and read it again slower, making sure she had each part before she moved to the next. Her father had not died in a car accident. She'd been told that. She'd been given that. A phone call to her aunt, a low voice through plaster car accident upstate, he was alone. She'd assembled those pieces into a story and lived inside it for 7 years. Not because it entirely made sense, it never had, but because it was the story available. And the alternative was a kind of uncertainty that a 10-year-old doesn't have the tools to sit inside. Her father had been the lead systems engineer for a project called Sentinel. He'd been employed by Nexara Corporation under a contract arrangement that he described in the letter as beginning legitimately and becoming something else. Project Sentinel, as he explained in 2 dense paragraphs, a man translating technical knowledge into words a non-specialist could understand, was a surveillance system, not a simple one. An artificial intelligence architecture capable of aggregating data from multiple sources, simultaneously recognizing faces in real time across linked camera networks, tracking individual movement through public and private spaces, and correlating that tracking with communications, data, financial data, purchasing patterns, social behavior. The word he used for it twice was comprehensive. He wrote it with the flatness of someone who understands that the most frightening things often present themselves as complete. Nexara had built the infrastructure. James Marsh had designed the core of it. He wrote about the early stages with a restraint that didn't entirely conceal what was underneath, a man describing something he had been proud of, something that had taken years of his best work before he understood what it was actually for. Then he understood. He didn't write in detail about how he found out. He wrote that he found out that the finding out was not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of information that crossed a threshold he couldn't step back from. Sentinel was not being built for the stated purpose. It was being built for sale. To governments, he wrote, and then the word authoritarian. He had the documentation. He had watched the negotiations. He had been present in rooms where things were said that couldn't be unsaid. He refused to complete the final phase. The letter was clear about this. He refused. He said no. He went to Victor Crane directly and said no. And then he took what documentation he could and left. And he spent 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do with what he knew and what he had. He was in contact with someone he trusted, a former colleague, someone who had left Nexara 2 years earlier and understood what it was. They were trying to figure out a path forward. He did not complete that path. He wrote, "They do not let people who know what I know simply walk away. I knew that. I thought I had more time." And then the last section. He had written it to her. Not to anyone else, not to a generic reader, to her. Callie. He wrote her name twice in that section, and both times her eyes stuck on it, on the shape of the word in his handwriting. Her name written by her father's hand on paper. She was holding 7 years after he should have written it. He wrote that he was sorry he hadn't been there. He wrote it plainly, without the hedging that people use when they're apologizing for things they think might be forgiven. He wrote it like a fact. He wrote that the device in the compartment contained the documentation. Everything. The contracts, the communications, the technical specifications, the records of negotiations with foreign governments, the records of what Sentinel was actually designed to do. He had put it all on the drive. It was enough. He wrote those 2 words with the weight of someone who needs to be believed. It was enough. And then they will come for it. And they will come for you once they know you have it. I'm sorry that's true. I'm sorry that I'm leaving you with this instead of something easier. He wrote, "Finish what I started." He wrote, "I love you." That was the end of the letter. She sat down on the floor of the compartment, the cold metal of it, the low ceiling above her, the shelves on either side. She held the 2 pages in both hands and looked at the last 3 words her father had written, and she did not cry, and she did not make any sound. She sat there. She sat there for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along the exact folds of the envelope and put it back inside and held the envelope in her hands. And after another moment, she put it in the front pocket of her backpack with the photograph, because that was where the things that mattered went, and she stood up. She took the flat rectangular case from the shelf, opened it. Inside, cushioned by foam cut to its exact shape, a device. Small, custom-built, not a commercial product, but something made for a specific purpose. A drive she understood. An external drive built to hold a very large amount of information and protect it against the things ordinary drives are not protected against. Her father had known what he was building. He'd built the container as carefully as the contents. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she put it in her backpack, wrapped in a shirt for additional protection, and zipped the backpack closed. She was looking at the other items on the shelves, thinking about whether she needed any of them when her phone buzzed. She kept it off as much as possible to preserve battery. She'd turned it on 20 minutes ago to check the time. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. No contact name, no area code she could identify. It said, "They know where you are. Move now." She read it once. She read it again. She looked at the number, which told her nothing. She looked at the time. The message had been sent 40 minutes ago, meaning her phone had received it the moment she turned it on, meaning someone had been waiting for her to power up. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up her backpack. She moved. She came out of the rear compartment, through the hallway, through the main body of the RV to the door. She opened it and stepped out onto the asphalt of the gas station lot. Earl Dawson was standing 20 feet away, not approaching, just standing, wearing the same jacket as the night she'd bought the RV from him, standing with the stillness of someone who has been waiting and is not surprised to see you and is not going to pretend otherwise. His hands were at his sides. His expression was the same as it had been that first night, patient, unhurried, something behind the eyes that she still hadn't been able to name. She stopped on the step of the RV. They looked at each other. "You read it," he said. It wasn't a question. "You knew," she said. Her voice was level. She was aware of making it level, of choosing the flatness deliberately, because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to let out in a gas station parking lot in the middle of the morning. "Yes," he said, "since the beginning." "Since before the beginning," he said. "Since before you got here." She came down the step, stood on the asphalt. The morning was cool and bright, the city going about its business around them, none of which had anything to do with what was happening in this corner of it. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at his hands, then back at her. "My name is Earl Dawson," he said, "which you know. What you don't know is that I worked with your father for 11 years at Nexara." He paused. Let that land. "I left 2 years before he did. I saw which way things were going, and I got out before I was too far in to get out clean. James stayed. I think he believed he could change the direction of it from inside. Men like your father believe things like that." He said this without judgment, with something closer to mourning. "He was wrong." "You knew he was going to die," Callie said. "I knew he was in danger," Earl said carefully. "There's a difference. I was trying to help him find a way out. We were working on it together, a path forward, some way to get the documentation to the right people, without him ending up—" He stopped, looked at the middle distance. "We ran out of time." "He's been dead for 7 years, she said. "Yes." "And you put his documentation in an RV and waited." "I put his documentation somewhere safe and waited for the right moment." His voice was quiet and even. "Crane's people searched everything connected to James after he died. His house, his car, his storage unit. They looked for the drive. They didn't find it because James gave it to me before the end, when he understood how things were going to go. I kept it safe." He paused. "I've been keeping an eye on you since you were 10. Enough to know where you were, how you were doing. Enough to know when things in that house changed." She said nothing. She was listening in the way she listened when she needed to hold everything she was being told in place long enough to evaluate it. The RV was mine, Earl said. Not in any official sense. I'd had it for years, used it mostly for storage, for the documentation, for the materials James left. When things in your house shifted, when it became clear that you were going to be forced out, I moved it here. Set the sign. He looked at the vehicle. $9. James used to say that was what an honest day's work was worth to the wrong kind of employer. He said it a lot. She looked at the RV. She looked back at Earl. The text, she said. That was you. Yes. How did you know they'd found me? Because I've been watching that building for years, he said. I know when Crane's people move with purpose. This morning they moved with purpose. She processed this. What do you know about the drive, she asked. What's on it? What it's worth? Enough to know that if it gets to the right people, Nexara is finished, he said. And Crane with it. And my father gets... She stopped. The sentence didn't have a clean end. What her father got was what he already had, which was nothing because he was dead and had been dead for 7 years, and no amount of justice changes that arithmetic. She knew that. She'd known it since she was 10 years old. But she let herself finish the sentence differently than she'd started it. And my father gets the truth told, she said. Earl nodded. Yes, he said. That. She shifted her backpack on her shoulders. The drive was in there, wrapped in a shirt, real and solid. I need to know one thing, she said. All right. You put me in the position of finding this. You arranged it. You made it so that I would be the one to walk into that RV and read his letter and carry his drive. She kept her voice even. Was that his choice or yours? Earl was quiet for a moment. A real moment, not the pause of someone buying time, but of someone being honest with themselves before they speak. Both, he said finally. James knew that if anything happened to him, this had to go somewhere. It couldn't be taken back. He understood that it had to be someone Crane's people couldn't simply remove, couldn't simply discredit, couldn't make disappear without consequences. And he understood that whoever carried it had to actually understand what was at stake, not be told, understand. He looked at her directly. He said if his daughter ever read that letter, she'd understand. She held that for a long moment. Then she heard it. Not close, but not far. The sound of vehicles moving at a deliberate pace into a space, doors opening in coordinated sequence, people exiting with controlled purpose. She'd never heard it before in her life, and she knew exactly what it was. She looked toward the far entrance of the parking lot. 2 black SUVs had pulled in. They were moving slowly, spreading as they came, one angling left and one continuing forward. Men in dark clothing stepping out before the vehicles had fully stopped. Earl said quietly, Go. Now. Don't run. She didn't run. She walked fast and deliberate toward the far side of the building, keeping the gas station structure between herself and the vehicles. Earl moved in a different direction. She registered this without turning to look, the two of them separating. The way people separate when they understand that 2 targets are harder to manage than one. She found the break in the chain link at the back of the property, the gap she'd noticed the first morning without consciously filing it, because she filed everything she noticed, even when she didn't know why. She went through it without slowing and into the service alley behind, moving between buildings, through the loading docks and dumpsters and unmarked doors that compose the functional underside of any street. She found a position between 2 dumpsters where she had a partial sight line back to the gas station lot. She watched. The men were efficient. They moved through the RV with the coordinated motion of people who have done this kind of thing before, who know what they're looking for and how to look for it. The whole process took 4 minutes. Then one of them came back out and shook his head at someone she couldn't see from this angle. Then she could see him. Victor Crane stepped out from behind the second SUV. He hadn't been visible before, had been there the whole time, the still center of all the purposeful movement around him. He stood at the edge of the parking lot and looked at the RV, and then he looked around the immediate area with the methodical scan she recognized, but slower this time, more focused. His gaze moved across the alley entrance, moved across the gap in the chain link, moved across the space between the dumpsters where she was standing. He stopped. He didn't move for a long moment. She didn't move either. She knew he probably couldn't see her. The angle was wrong, the distance too great, the light behind her rather than on her. She knew this probably almost certainly, and she still could not make herself look away. He had killed her father. She did not know this the way you know a fact you can cite. She knew it the way you know things that live below the level of citation in the body, in the cold that spreads outward from somewhere central, when something true arrives in a form you can't refuse. He had taken her father from her at 10 years old and handed the family a story about a car accident, and she had lived inside that story for 7 years because it was the only one available. He was standing 50 yards away from her, and he didn't know it. Then he smiled, small, precise, the smile of a man who has done this before and expects to do it again, who understands that patience is a form of power when you have resources and the other person doesn't. The smile of someone who believes they've already won and is simply giving the situation time to confirm what he already knows. He turned away, said something to one of the men, got back into the SUV. The two vehicles pulled out of the lot and were gone. She stayed where she was for another minute. Two, letting the quiet settle, letting the ordinary sounds of the city reestablish themselves over the sound of her own pulse. Then she straightened up and came out from between the dumpsters and stood in the alley. The drive was in her backpack. Her father's letter was in her front pocket with his photograph. She was 17 years old in an alley in Austin, Texas, and the man who had killed her father had just smiled at a parking lot and driven away in a black car because he believed he was untouchable. She thought about that smile for a long moment. Then she started walking. She had somewhere to be now. That was different from 3 days ago, different from every morning she could remember in the last 4 years. She had a drive, a name, and a direction. She walked like someone who knew all three. Austin moved around her in its ordinary Tuesday way, the traffic and the storefronts, and the people with their coffees and their phones and their faces pointed toward wherever they were going next. She was moving through it differently now, not carried by it, moving through it with intent. She had the drive. She had the letter. She had the photograph. She was beginning to understand the only thing that Victor Crane needed badly enough to send two vehicles and a team of men to a gas station parking lot in the middle of the morning, which meant she also had something she hadn't had 48 hours ago. Leverage. The word felt large for what she actually was, a 17-year-old girl with a backpack in a city that didn't know her name. But leverage wasn't about size. She understood that now. It wasn't about resources or credentials or the accumulated weight of a life that other people had reason to take seriously. It was about having the one thing the other person needed. And she had it. The question was what she did with it. She found a bench in a small park near a public library branch, a few trees, a path, some grass that gets mowed occasionally. She sat and watched two pigeons negotiate over something near the base of a trash can and thought about her father. Not the father in the letter, not James Marsh, lead systems engineer, the man who had built something he came to be ashamed of and died trying to undo it. She thought about the father she had known, or thought she'd known, the man in the gray t-shirt, the man who sat next to her when she was upset and didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The man who said things like every locked door was locked by someone for a reason, and she had been young enough to hear it as something generic, the kind of thing adults said because adults were supposed to say things, not because the words were loaded with something specifically true. He had known. When he said those things to her, when he sat next to her in the quiet, when he looked at her, the way the photograph caught him, looking slightly squinting against the light, smiling like he didn't know anyone was watching. He had known what he was doing and what the cost of it might be, and he had kept his face arranged into something that looked like ordinary fatherhood because she was 10 years old, and he was trying to give her as much of that as he had left to give. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She stayed like that for a moment, just that. Then she took her hands away and looked at the pigeons and made herself think clearly. Earl had said the right people. Getting the documentation to the right people was what her father had been trying to figure out when he ran out of time. Earl had spent 7 years keeping the drive safe and watching her from a distance and waiting for a moment that apparently required her specifically. None of that was a plan. A plan was what she needed now, and she did not have one yet. She thought about Nexara, about the cameras and the guards, and the organized thoroughness of the men who had gone through the RV. About Crane's smile in the parking lot, small and precise and certain. She thought about what Earl had said about an FBI agent who had built a case and had it closed under her before it could go anywhere. He'd given her a name this morning quickly before they separated. Margot Finch, FBI Field Office, Austin. She thought about that name for a long time. Then she did something she'd been avoiding since the night Greg told her to get her stuff. She turned on her phone and called her mother. The phone rang 4 times. She was already composing the version of herself that would leave a voicemail when the call connected. Callie. Noreen's voice. She could hear something in it immediately, the quality of bracing, the sound of someone who has been waiting for something they've been dreading. Mom, she said. She hadn't planned what she was going to say next. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then, I need you to tell me something true. Callie, where are you? Are you? Just tell me something true, she said. That's all I'm asking. One thing. Then I'll let you go. A long pause. She heard her mother breathing. She heard beneath the breathing the ambient quality of a house in the middle of the day, the refrigerator hum, the particular silence of a space where someone lives with a kind of tension they've gotten used to. Okay, Noreen said. Something had gone out of her voice, the defensive quality, the management. What was left was smaller and more honest. Dad, Callie said. Did he die in a car accident? The pause this time was different, longer, the length and texture of a pause that contains a decision being made. No, Noreen said. The words sat between them. Nexara, Callie said. Another pause, shorter this time, as if each confirmed thing made the next one slightly easier to release. Yes. And Greg. She kept her voice flat. Greg knew before you married him. The longest pause yet. She heard her mother make a sound that wasn't a word. Then, Greg was placed, Noreen said. Each word was deliberate, chosen the voice of someone who has rehearsed this sentence in private for a long time and is saying it out loud for the first time. He was placed by them to keep an eye on things, on me, to make sure nothing came out. Callie sat with that for a moment. A man installed in her family like a component in a system. A marriage that was surveillance. 4 years of her life in a house with a stepfather who was there for reasons that had nothing to do with her mother or with family or with any of the things people tell themselves when they're assembling a life after a loss. The night they kicked me out, she said, they knew. They'd found out that you were asking questions, Noreen said. Her voice had gone very thin. About your father, small things. Things you said to me, I wasn't. She stopped, started again. Greg was listening. He told them. They decided it was better to remove you before you found anything. Before she found anything, she had a drive in her backpack with everything her father had died to protect. She had spent 2 nights in a broken RV. She had $15 left, and she hadn't slept a full night since before any of this started. You knew, Callie said. You knew all of it, and you sat at the kitchen table. Callie, I'm not asking you to explain it, she said. I'm not calling to hear why. I'm telling you what I know so that you understand what's happening now. She heard her own voice, and it was steady, and she was grateful for that steadiness, the way you're grateful for a good pair of shoes on a long walk. I have what Dad left. I have everything, and I'm going to do what he was trying to do. The silence on the other end was complete. Be careful, Noreen said finally. So quiet it was almost nothing. Please be careful. Callie ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hands. The battery was at 22%. She turned it back off, conserving what was left. Then she stood up from the bench and walked to the library. The library was warm and quiet and smelled like paper and climate control, and she spent 40 minutes at one of the public computer terminals doing research with the focused efficiency of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and doesn't have time for anything adjacent to it. She looked for Margot Finch. The name was present only in the indirect ways that working agents exist in the public record. A case mentioned in a local news piece from 4 years ago. A quote in a city council meeting transcript. A name in the footer of a press release. She was real. She was active. She was based at the Austin field office on the north side of the city. She also found in an archive piece from a regional business publication dated 6 years ago a single paragraph that mentioned a federal inquiry into Nexara Corporation's government contracts, described as preliminary and ultimately closed due to insufficient evidence. Insufficient evidence. She logged off the terminal, thanked the librarian who hadn't asked her anything, and walked out. The FBI field office was 40 minutes on foot. She walked. The building was not what she'd pictured, which she realized was because she'd pictured something from television. The reality was more bureaucratic, a low building in a business park recognizable less by signage than by the quality of its plainness, the deliberate lack of character that official spaces tend to share. She stood at the entrance for a moment. She thought about all the ways this could go wrong. She was 17. She had no ID beyond a school card. She had no official status, no lawyer, no adult standing beside her in any functional sense. She had a drive of unknown content that her dead father had built in secret, carried inside a backpack with some clothes and a granola bar wrapper and a photograph. She was going to walk into a federal building and ask to speak to a specific agent about a corporation that had already 6 years ago successfully had its federal inquiry shut down. She pushed the door open and went inside. The receptionist was a man in his 40s with the expression of someone who has heard many things in this lobby and expects to hear another one now. "I need to speak to Agent Margot Finch," Callie said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Can I ask what this is regarding?" "Nexara Corporation," she said, "and a man named Victor Crane, and a project called Sentinel." She paused. "And my father who worked for them and died before he could finish what he started." The receptionist looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. She waited 40 minutes in a plastic chair near the window. She watched the parking lot and the street beyond it and thought about nothing specific, the ability to exist in a holding pattern without letting the uncertainty of the waiting collapse into something unmanageable. Her father had probably done this too. Waited in rooms patient, organizing his thoughts, believing in the forward motion of things, even when the things weren't moving. A door opened. A woman came through it. She was somewhere in her mid-40s. Medium height, dark hair going silver at the temples in stripes rather than evenly, which gave her face a quality of lived-in integrity. She was wearing what you wear when you work in an office and have given up pretending the clothes are anything other than functional. She was looking at Callie with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just present, fully there. The expression of someone who has learned to read a room before they commit to being in it. "Callie Marsh," she said. "Yes." "I'm Margot Finch." She didn't extend her hand. She just stood and looked at her with the same steady presence. "You mentioned Nexara." "Yes." "Come with me." The room she led her to was small with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked at an interior wall of the building. Margot Finch sat across from her. She had a legal pad and a pen, and she placed both on the table without opening the pad. "Tell me," she said. So Callie told her. She told her everything in order without editorializing, without the emotional texture that the events actually carried, just the sequence of facts as they had occurred. She had learned this from her father without knowing she was learning it. He had always said that the most useful thing you could give someone was accurate information clearly delivered. So she delivered it clearly. The RV, the documents, the address, Nexara. Crane identified by photograph. The compartment, the letter, the drive. Finch listened without interrupting. She had the quality of a rare kind of listener, the kind who is actually receiving what you're saying rather than waiting for space to respond. She made no notes. She watched Callie's face. When Callie finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Finch said, "I had an open investigation into Nexara 6 years ago." "I know," Callie said. "I read about it." It was closed. A pause. I was told insufficient evidence, which was true in the legal sense. In every other sense, it was not true. Callie said nothing. I've been waiting for a thread, Finch said. She said it the way people state things they've lived with long enough to stop feeling dramatic about them. For 6 years, I've been waiting for something I could pull on. Something solid. Her eyes moved to the backpack on the chair beside Callie. You said your father put documentation on a drive. Yes. May I see it? Callie reached into the backpack. She unwrapped the drive from the shirt she'd packed it in and set it on the table between them. Finch looked at it without touching it. She leaned forward slightly. Then she stood and left the room without saying anything, which Callie understood as a good sign, or at least not a bad one. She came back 3 minutes later with another person, a younger man who sat down across from the drive and looked at it for a moment, then took a pair of gloves from his jacket pocket and put them on before he touched it. He turned it over, examined the connection port, looked at the surface of the casing, then he looked up. There's a secondary lock, he said, physical, integrated into the build. He turned it to show Finch and then angled it toward Callie. On the underside of the device, partially recessed into the casing, a small circular surface whose texture was slightly different from the surrounding material. Biometric, the man said. Fingerprint. He set it down. They both looked at Callie. She understood before they said it. She understood it the way she'd been understanding things over the past 2 days, not through analysis, but through some mechanism below analysis. Some part of her that had been listening to the logic of all of this and had arrived at the conclusion before the visible evidence made it explicit. Her father had built a drive that could only be opened by his daughter. Not by Earl, not by an agent or a lawyer or whoever might find themselves in possession of it, by any route other than the one that led through her specifically. He had designed it this way. He had sat somewhere in some moment of clarity or desperation or both, and decided that the only person in the world who could not be coerced or removed or replaced was Callie, because she was his. Because that was a fact that Nexara and Victor Crane and all the resources available to either of them could not undo or duplicate or take away. She reached across the table and pressed her right thumb to the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. She kept her thumb flat and still and waited. Then a small light embedded in the casing shifted from red to green. The man exhaled. It was a quiet sound, almost nothing, but it was there. He connected the drive to a laptop he'd brought in with him. The screen populated with files. Callie couldn't read them from across the table, but she could see the volume of them, the density folder structures that indicated something organized and comprehensive, something a person had spent significant time building with the intention of it being complete. Enough. Her father had written that word with emphasis. It was enough. The man looked at Finch. Start at the top level, Finch said. Quiet. Something had changed in the room in a way Callie felt but couldn't see. A quality of attention had shifted. He opened a folder, then another. He read in silence for several minutes. Finch moved around the table to stand behind him and read over his shoulder. Callie sat and watched them read and felt the sensation of waiting. When the waiting is almost over, when the thing you've been moving toward is no longer over the horizon, but in front of you, visible real close enough to touch. Finch said very quietly to no one in particular, "There it is." She straightened up. She looked at Callie. Her expression had not changed dramatically, but something behind it had resolved the way things resolve when a long uncertainty finally finds its answer. Your father, Finch said. He was thorough. He was careful, Callie said. About everything. Finch nodded slowly. Then she pulled out the chair next to Callie's and sat down in it close the way someone sits when what they're about to say requires proximity. I can open an investigation with this, she said. What's on this drive is enough to reopen and substantially expand the case I had 6 years ago. Nexara can be subpoenaed. Crane can be brought in. The project can be examined by people with the authority to do something about it. She paused. But here's what I need you to understand. Crane has resources. He has lawyers. He will know the moment a federal investigation is formally open that someone has given us something, and he will spend every hour from that moment forward trying to find out what we have and discredit it before it can be used. What does that mean for the drive? Kelly asked. The drive is evidence, Finch said, but evidence from an anonymous source with a chain of custody that a good lawyer will spend weeks attacking. She looked at Callie steadily. What I need if this is going to hold is Crane on record, saying something that confirms his awareness of and involvement in what's on this drive. Something we can use alongside the documentation to close every door he'll try to open. Callie understood what she was saying. You need him to come to something, she said. I need him to come to you, Finch said. He's already looking for you. He knows you have something, or he suspects it. If he believed he had the opportunity to recover the drive directly, he would take that opportunity. You want me to be the bait. Finch didn't flinch from the word. I want you to be the one thing he can't ignore, she said. Yes. The room was quiet. Callie thought about Crane's smile in the parking lot. Small, precise, certain. The smile of someone who believed the arithmetic of this situation had already been calculated, and the result was inevitable, and the result was him. I'll do it, she said. Finch studied her face for a moment. You understand what I'm saying. You would be present, in the location, alone from his perspective. I understood you, Callie said. Another moment, then Finch nodded. All right. They spent 2 hours planning. Finch was methodical in the way of someone who has prepared for situations like this before, who knows which variables matter and which are noise, who moves through logistics with the efficiency of genuine competence rather than performance. She asked Callie questions and listened to the answers and incorporated them. Callie answered everything she was asked. She was honest about what she knew and clear about what she didn't. The location was Callie's suggestion. The gas station lot, the RV, the place Crane already knew about the place. His people had already searched the place. He would believe he had already controlled. He would not expect her to go back to it, which was exactly why going back made sense. Finch made calls. Callie sat in the room and listened to the half of conversation she could hear and pieced together the rest. By the time the light through the window had shifted into late afternoon, the shape of the evening was clear. Callie asked for 20 minutes alone. They gave her a small room with a phone charger and a cup of coffee. She didn't drink, and she sat and looked at the wall and thought about her father. Not strategically, not in any way useful to the next several hours. Just thought about him. The gray t-shirt, the backyard, the way he would sit next to her in the quiet and let the quiet be enough. She thought about the version of him she was finally getting to know, the one the letter had introduced her to, the man who had built something and then refused it and paid the price for the refusal. She thought about what it costs a person to do the right thing, when the wrong thing would be safer, when the wrong thing would let you go home and see your daughter and sit in the yard while she takes your photograph without telling you. She thought about what it means to finish something for someone who couldn't. She took the photograph out of her pocket, set it on the table in front of her, the man in the gray shirt squinting against the summer light. She looked at him for the last quiet moment before everything that was coming. I've got it from here, she said. The gas station lot at dusk had a different quality than she'd seen it have before. The sky was the orange and gray of a Texas evening that can't decide whether to be beautiful or ominous and settles for both. The gas station lights were coming on. The ordinary sounds of the adjacent street were beginning their evening transition, less traffic, different voices, the general movement of a city shifting gears. She sat on the steps of the RV. The door was still broken from when Crane's people had forced it. She'd pushed it back into its frame well enough that it held, but the damage was visible. She sat on the top step and looked at the lot and the street beyond it, and she waited. Finch's people were in position. She couldn't see them, which was the point. She knew they were there the way she'd known Earl was there that morning, as a fact that didn't require visibility to be real. She had the drive in her pocket. She waited. He came alone. That was the first thing she noticed. No SUVs this time. No team. Just a dark car that pulled into the far end of the lot without hurry, parking near the edge where the light was worst, and a single figure getting out of it. Crane had decided that the recovery of a drive from a 17-year-old girl was not a situation that required a team. This told her something about how he had calculated the distance between them, the gap he believed to exist between his kind of power and hers. He crossed the lot toward her. He was wearing a jacket now instead of the full suit, something more casual, which she noted. He had decided to approach this as something less than formal, something he could resolve quietly person to person without the apparatus of authority. He stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at her, then at the RV, then back at her. His expression was measured, composed. Whatever he felt, he had spent a lifetime learning to keep it below the surface. "You're James Marsh's daughter," he said. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he already knew but wanted on record between them. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been learning things," she said, "about my father, about what he built, about what you did with it." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not much, just enough. "Your father was a talented man," he said. "He made choices that were unfortunately not in his best interest." "Or yours," she said. A pause. He looked at her with the look of someone recalibrating, slightly reassessing something he'd underestimated. "You have something that belongs to Nexara," he said. "I think you know that. And I think you're also intelligent enough to understand that the most practical resolution here is simple. You give me what you have, and whatever this has been for you over the last few days, it ends. You walk away from it. You're young. You have—" "He built the drive so only I could open it," Callie said. Crane was quiet. "He knew you'd come for it eventually," she said. "He knew whoever had it might be coerced or threatened or removed. So he made it so that the only person in the world who could access it was his daughter." She looked at him steadily. "He planned for you, for exactly this, for the part where you show up and tell me I have something that belongs to you. What he put on that drive is everything," she said, "every contract, every communication, every negotiation with every government you were planning to sell Sentinel to. The whole project, all of it. He documented it completely because he understood that if he was going to stop it, the documentation had to be complete." She paused. "He was very thorough. You knew that about him. That's why you had him killed." The word was in the air between them now. Crane looked at her for a long moment. "That's a very serious allegation," he said. His voice was still composed, but something had changed in the quality of his stillness, in the way his body was positioned. Something was working behind his eyes that he was managing not to show on his face. "It's not an allegation," she said. "It's what the documentation shows and what the letter he left me confirms." She reached into her pocket. Not for the drive. She took out the letter still in its envelope, still with her name on the front in her father's handwriting. She held it where he could see it, but didn't offer it to him. He wrote it himself, in his own words, before they got to him. Crane looked at the envelope. She watched something move through him that he could not entirely contain. Not fear, or not only fear, something more complicated. Something that looked for a very brief moment like recognition, like seeing something you've tried to avoid seeing for a long time and finding it standing in front of you in the form of a 17-year-old girl holding a letter in a gas station parking lot at dusk. She was James Marsh's daughter, and she was holding the thing he had written before Crane had taken him from her, and the weight of that was visible in him for exactly one unguarded second before he closed it back down. "You're making a mistake," he said. His voice was quiet. "My father made a mistake," she said. "He thought he had more time. I don't have that problem. I've already made the decisions that needed to be made." She looked at him directly without looking away. "The documentation is already with the FBI. Agent Finch has had it for 6 hours. By the time you get back to Nexara, there will be agents there with paperwork that you're not going to be able to make go away." He was very still. "This is over," she said. What you built, what you were going to sell, what you did to stop my father from stopping you. All of it. It's over. The stillness held for one more moment. Then he moved a small, fast, decisive movement toward her, the movement of a man who has decided that the conversation is done and what comes next is something else entirely. He stopped because the lights came on. From three directions, from positions she'd known were there. Without being able to see them, the lot went bright with the hard brightness of people with authority and equipment announcing their presence. She heard voices clear and loud, and using words that were legal and final and left no room for interpretation. She watched Victor Crane process the situation, watched him calculate and find no exit, and arrive at the end of his calculation with the stillness of someone who has, for the first time in a long time, run out of moves. He looked at her one last time. She looked back at him. She thought about her father, not the man in the gray shirt, not the photograph, the man in the letter, the man who had stood in front of Victor Crane and said no, knowing what the no would cost him, and said it anyway because the alternative was something he couldn't live with. She came from that. Whatever else she was and whatever else she would become, she came from that refusal and its cost. And she was standing now in the place he had been trying to reach for years. She had finished the walk he had started. She watched them put handcuffs on Victor Crane in a gas station parking lot in Austin, Texas, in the last of the evening light. She watched it and she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not triumph, which was too simple, not relief, which was too small, but something in the space between those things. Something that had more weight to it than either. Something that felt like the sensation of a door finally opening after a very long time, and light coming through it into a space that had been dark for a long time, and the air changing in that space the way it changes when it hasn't moved in years, and finally does. Margot Finch appeared at her shoulder. She said nothing for a moment. They both watched the lot. "The arrest on Hollins came through 20 minutes ago," she said. "Federal warrant. He's in custody." Callie nodded. Finch looked at her. "You did well," she said. The kind of directness that meant more than warmth because it cost something. "Your father would have—" She stopped, reconsidered. "You did well," she said again, because that was enough, and they both knew it was enough. The lot was busy now with the organized activity of law enforcement doing its work. People with lanyards and gloves, and the focused movement of professionals with a clear task. The RV was there in the middle of all of it, still broken, still rusted, still itself sitting at the edge of the gas station lot like a thing that had outlasted every expectation of it. She walked toward it. Not because she needed to, not to retrieve anything she had, everything she was taking. She walked toward it because it had been, for a very brief and very strange chapter of her life, the only thing that had asked nothing of her and given her everything she needed. A roof and four walls and a space to exist in when the alternative was the rain and the road and nowhere to go. She put her hand on the side of it. Cold metal rust under her fingers, the surface rough and honest in the way of things that have been left out in the weather a long time and have stopped pretending to be anything other than what they are. She thought about what it means to find something exactly when you need it. Not before, not after, not in any more comfortable or convenient form. Just exactly when. She thought about her father putting his name on documents in a metal box in a cabinet in a broken vehicle, betting on the specific person she would turn out to be, not because he could be certain of who she would become, but because he knew who she came from and he trusted that. She took the photograph out of her pocket. She looked at it in the light that was left. The man in the gray shirt, the backyard, the summer light and the paint stain on his shoulder, and the smile of someone who doesn't know the picture is being taken, who is just alive in that moment, in the ordinary way of people who don't yet know what's coming. She had known this man as a father, and now she knew him as something larger than that, as a person who had done a difficult right thing and paid for it and left her everything she needed to finish it. She held both versions of him at once and found that they were not contradictory. The man who sat quietly next to her when she was upset, and the man who refused Victor Crane and wrote her a letter she would find 7 years later, were the same man. The specifics of who he was had always been there in the things she remembered most about him. The way he let silence be enough. The way he didn't fill space with things that weren't true just because the truth was harder to carry. She pressed the photograph to her chest for a moment. Just a moment. Just the weight of it. Just the paper and the image of him, just that. Then she put it back in her pocket carefully in the place where things that mattered went. She turned away from the RV. The eastern sky over Austin was going dark in the way that skies go dark when the daytime is finished and what comes next hasn't begun yet. The stars weren't visible yet, but they were there behind the remaining light, waiting for the process of the evening to complete itself so they could finally be seen. She picked up her backpack. She had $15 in her pocket, which was more than she'd had at the beginning of this, and it was enough to start with, and starting with enough was more than most people got. She walked out of the gas station lot without looking back. She was 17 years old. 3 days ago, she had walked into the rain with $9 and a photograph and nowhere to go. 3 days ago, the only story she had about her father was a car accident and a phone call her aunt had taken in another room. 3 days ago, she didn't know what she was made of in any real sense, only what she'd been told, and what she'd been told was very little, and most of it was wrong. Now she had his letter in her pocket and his drive in the hands of people who could do something with it, and she had, in whatever accounting system keeps track of the things a person does with what they're given, done what she came here to do, what he had asked her to do, what she had not known she was being prepared to do every time he sat next to her in the quiet and let the silence be enough. She walked. Austin stretched out ahead of her in all directions. The city in the evening, ordinary and vast and indifferent in the way that cities are indifferent to any particular story happening inside them. She was part of it now, and she would figure out what that meant the same way she'd figured out everything else over the past 3 days. One step at a time, paying attention to what was actually there, rather than what she'd expected to find. Her father had been right about locked doors. The reason always tells you something true. And sometimes the reason is that someone locked a door to keep the truth safe until the right person came along to open it. She kept walking into the city, into whatever was next, carrying his name forward, into a world that was about to learn it.